Thank you for joining, Phil. Pleasure to have you with us today. Isn't really something that I've particularly dove into myself with aerial photography. So you're the aerial director of photography for the aerial film company. You've worked on the likes of Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning, F1 the movie, upcoming Supergirl, and what we're going to talk a little bit more about, Apex. So for those at home, what actually is your job as aerial director of photography?
I act as like an extension to the director of photography on most movies. So, ultimately the job as an aerial director of photography is capturing anything from the air. Now, our specialism at the aerial film companies, mostly helicopters, planes, that sort of stuff. So full-size cameras on manned aircraft. And it's a very technical job in terms of the technical knowledge that goes into it, and then obviously a very specialized job where you don't necessarily have an awful lot of time to get it right. Hence, productions tend to sort of, go to specialist companies like us at the Aero Film Company, and find the sort of right pilot and the DOP to hop onto a project. So, yeah, in essence, realistically, it's like just another unit of a film, just like you'd have a second unit director of photography or whatever. You've got an aerial director of photography, and I then interface with either main unit or second unit or pickups or anything of the like.
So practically, you're not the one flying or piloting. So you're there in the helicopter, whatever vehicle, controlling the camera then, I'm assuming.
Yeah, so it's a to sort of boil it down to the most simple sort of combination. We've got a pilot in our company, that's co-director of the company, Will Banks. He's the helicopter pilot. I operate the camera, so he will sit in the front, obviously fly us around, and then I sit in the back with my monitors and with my controls and basically control the gimbal that's mounted on the outside of the helicopter to sort of achieve all these shots.
The question that I was asking myself when I was first looking into your work and the work of the company is how do you even get into something like this? I can't imagine you're there 7 years old going, yeah, I'm going to be an aerial cinematographer when I grow up.
Yeah, I think you're certainly right. I think part of that is also like the knowledge that these jobs exist is one of those things. Realistically, I've always wanted to work in film. Like when I was little, I've always wanted to work in film, or I've wanted to be a pilot. I think like most young boys probably go or girls go, oh, that'd be quite cool to have an office in the sky. But I think the love for film sort of be out the sort of pilot side or the flying side. So I started working in film and just, or making film, so to speak, just by myself, like would pick up a camera and just shoot some stuff. And ultimately, I found myself in the future sort of getting into a bit of a niche, which was like extreme sports and all that kind of stuff. And when you're dealing with these things, such as like fast motorbikes or for example, like surfing or, skydiving, wingsuiting, all that sort of stuff, you sort of start going, okay, how do we capture this in like the most dramatic way possible and what can actually keep up? And that was sort of the segue into the aerial world. I was doing a lot of these extreme sports projects, out in the US and out in the Middle East, especially. And when I then came back to the UK to kind of find a bit more of a grounding in the film industry, you then sort of pivot that role into the film world, and that's where that sort of grew.
Something I noticed with your previous projects and your credits is that you were a phantom technician. I'm assuming that's the
Mm.
super high frame rate
Yeah.
cameras. Is that something that you miss working with? Because I imagine that's probably a lot of fun to work with, although very technical.
Yeah, so the way that came about, I used to own a Phantom Flex 4K camera, and that was a friend of mine, a director in the US, and myself. We used to do a lot of these extreme sports projects, and we owned that camera and used that for a lot of things. And again, when I came to the UK, it was like, okay, so the need for these extreme projects and sports and all that, the industry is not that big in the UK for that. So it sort of segued into taking these cameras on a film set with a company called Love High Speed, chap called Jason Berman and Stephen Price. And it was like an interesting one because it exposes you to these sets, right? Like where you're then all of a sudden bringing this camera that you have a certain way of operating in the past, like very much one man band type thing, two people, and all of a sudden you're bringing it onto a film set. And it's such a different workflow, right? Where you're putting that camera sort of into the hands of the camera department, the operators or the DPs, and then you're basically sitting off board with a magliner, like controlling all of this stuff remotely. And you're right, it is a very technical thing to do because you've got limited buffers that you can shoot, only for like 4 or 8 seconds at a time. And then at the same time as a technician, ultimately what you most of the time what you're doing is you're shooting it at the same time you're then getting cards back and you're offloading and transcoding as like a full thing. So it appealed to my technical nature, put it that way. I quite like the sort of technicalities that go into all of these things, and that's something that's still very present in the job now in the aerial systems. They're incredibly complex um, technical systems, and I sort of get to yeah do that still.
Would there ever be a scenario where you'd slap a phantom onto one of your helicopters?
Yeah, we've done it. We've done it
Oh, you've
before.
actually done that before. I didn't
Yeah,
think that would
yeah.
even be a thing you can do.
Yeah, no, it is. It's the camera systems that we have. We've got the shot over F1, the shot over K1, so they're just two different sizes, sort of same architecture, same functionality, and you can put just about any camera into it because the K1 is a massive beast. So, whether it's a Phantom or you want to fly, 35 mm film or even up to IMAX or big digital cameras, you can sort of just about put anything in there. So whenever project demands that, you can do it. Obviously, with the Phantom, it's such a niche thing, even on the ground, that for the job to come around to do it in the air is obviously quite rare. But it's yeah, anything's possible, really.
There you go. One last thing before moving on to
Mhm.
Apex specifically. I need to talk about Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning
Yeah,
and that stuff. I've never seen anything like that on screen ever before with the biplane sequence at
yeah,
the end. And especially you've got that Instagram video of
yeah,
your helicopter following the biplanes. And even just
yeah,
watching that, thinking, my God, it's absolutely
yeah.
ridiculous. After doing that project, did you have the feeling of, how the hell do we even top this?
Oh, yeah, for sure. And we still talk about that. Like, how do you, in terms of the flying that you do, also how sustained it was. We were doing it for months at a time to build this sequence. And it's like a one in a million jobs where you get to really play and really sort of rehearse this and then keep working yourself in. What you see on that Instagram video, that's at the end of months of shooting. You're obviously sort of working towards these things. Um, but I think we find the sort of challenges and the opportunities in other projects where, it might not necessarily be the same sort of all-out attack in like an air-to-air sequence with Tom Cruise flying a plane or dangling around a plane. But there are so many challenges in other things. Like, after Mission, we did the F1 film, and it was interesting because Mission was very sort of, there was a big exploration in terms of like, how do you shoot this sequence? Like, how do we find the best angles? And because no one's shot something like that before, you're sort of going into this with a really open mind, like, what lenses? How do we approach this? How do we do it safely? Whereas then we went on to Formula One, and the first shot we did there was like super previs, right? It was like, this is exactly what we need, and it was in a congested area at Silverstone race circuit. So then the challenges come from like, okay, you need like the most robust risk assessment, otherwise it just won't get approved by like the 4 or 5 stakeholders in the regulator. And then it's like, okay, now fly the previs. They were watching the previs on one screen and then watching the shot on the other one, and it's like, we want that, so you then have to deliver it. So there's different challenges, and it's quite interesting in other jobs, you travel, so the to sort of far away locations. So the challenges then come from sourcing the right helicopters, the right permissions, and getting your equipment there in one piece. And there's if the challenges aren't posed, we'll make up our own, just to keep it exciting, put it that way. But yeah, Mission Impossible was certainly one of those sort of all-time great projects for us in terms of, the enjoyment of actually creating it.
When it comes to Apex, was there anything that stood out when getting on board with the project, whether that's like with the script or kind of like what you were pitched with the project, of, oh, we could do something fun or cool here.
Yeah, so Apex, obviously, a big part. I've only watched it last night, but obviously there's sort of these two sections. The one section that we were really involved with that was that beginning Norwegian climbing scene, right? So I think the rest of it was shot mostly on drones and on the ground, obviously in Australia. So for us, the request sort of came, okay, we want to start this film, and it's this like crazy thing where she's climbing the troll wall in in Norway. And it's interesting because I've shot maybe like 4 or 5 jobs at the troll wall, so I know the location very well. And I'm like, it's an amazing structure and it's massive, right? But like portraying it to be as big as it is quite a challenge. So, when they came to us, there were like two parts. There was like, okay, we want to introduce this film in this like amazing epic scale. And then obviously we need the technical side behind that. We need an array so that we're basically shooting plates, tiling the whole area so that when they're basically shooting people in a volume on green screen or whatever, that they've sort of got things for the background. So again, like, two distinctive requirements that you're then basically going to Norway. I think we started shooting on the single camera just to shoot these big establishers and all of that and her journey up the wall. And then, we would then sort of in situ like replace to the array, shoot some array stuff, go back to the single camera. So there was a technical thing because you're working in such cold temperatures. I mean, I think it was in January or something like that. So, you're talking Norway, probably about -20. So then how do you keep equipment from freezing up? Like, how do you physically work with bits that are mostly metal and glass, like in such a cold environment? So it's all about basically, trying to figure out how to make the environment work for you.
With, I mean, not just with Apex, but in terms of your aerial photography in general, like
Hmm.
how much do you think about narrative when it comes to those shots? So is it all very much almost like the F1 where you just got to go out and match the previs? Like, do you get to have that little bit of narrative input or thinking about, okay, these aerial shots, how is that portraying characters and themes and narrative?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think it's very project dependent. I think there are some jobs that come to us and they basically just want some pretties of a city. So you go out and you shoot the prettiest stuff. Most of them go, okay, this is a specific area and there's a beat of action that happens here, and we need like connecting tissues from one thing to the next. With Formula One, we did a lot of this stuff in Abu Dhabi where, again, we were basically given free reign to create, but then it was like there are these beats in the story that we really need of like overtakes and parts where pivotal action happens. So you're then trying to basically figure out, okay, what's the visual language of this film and how do we basically add to it? And it's a similar thing in most of these films, like you are always trying to add to the narrative. And I think one of the really important things for our job is, for me, I need to be like a chameleon and basically emulate a DP style, but in the air, right? Because if I just went out and said, okay, I'm just going to shoot some really pretty stuff, that's one thing. But if it doesn't match the language that the director of photography has established on the ground, for example, or the camera movement or the directions that, production has basically established, then ultimately, you're just gonna stick out like a thorn, in the final edit. So I think that's one of the really big things, is to really understand how these films are shot and then basically add to it rather than just feel like a bit of stock footage plopped into the edit.
So you've obviously worked very closely with Lauren Scher, the DP
Yeah.
for Apex. Were there other departments that you worked with closely, or even the cast at all?
It depends on the films. It depends on the interaction with the cast. I mean, so much of what we do is second unit or in addition to main unit. So when we did Apex, closely with Lawrence Sher, obviously shooting his opening sequence, and it's one of those things for DP as well. You go, okay, this is how we're opening the film. It needs to be right. So there's a big focus on how are we going to shoot this. A big interaction that we usually have is with visual effects supervisors, because obviously massive elements of this are VFX based as well. We're often shooting plates and all of that for supervisors to basically put their things into. And when it comes to cast, I mean, Mission Impossible was one of those outliers where, the main cast is also the pilot. So you have a very close working relationship. And it can't actually be like us as an aviation crew to an actor. The relationship really has to be like pilot to pilot and aviation to aviation, because otherwise you've got these blocks and barriers and misunderstandings where you basically have to suspend that and just go, look, we're here trying to do a job. We all want to stay in one piece. And a lot of films, often we do a lot of close proximity work to actors. So in that regard, a lot of this comes down to the safety element of like, look, this is what we're gonna do. If you're unhappy, you tell us. So yeah, it's really dependent on the sort of creative treatment of the film.
with Apex, obviously it was all very much that troll wall.
Hmm.
Gosh, that is a
Oh,
really
well,
hard
yeah.
thing to say five
Yeah.
times tonight. With that Norway sequence, is there a particular shot or moment that you're proud of?
Yeah, I think one of the things with the troll wall sequence that is an interesting one is because there were no ground cameras of that sequence. So the whole thing was an aerial sequence. So it was basically like, okay, so you're opening this film. Obviously, there are things that are shot on a stage that basically get put into that environment, but you still establish that environment from the helicopter, and then you provide basically a full suite of like elements that they can use to make that sequence believable. And looking at it, I think what worked really well there was like the sort of peril of them on the wall and also the scale of it. So I think it was a cool thing to see like how well we could actually sell this entire scene with basically just using a helicopter.
You're shooting with a company with helicopters. Do you get people that go up to you and say, "Why don't you just use drones?" So I suppose this is kind of like the give you the floor to say, "Why helicopters? What makes them so
Yeah,
unique and stand
it's
out for us?"
it's an interesting one, right? Because there was a time when you're going back 3, 4, 5 years, maybe, where it was like, oh, helicopters are done, drones are going to do everything. And drones started to do a lot of things. But then there was a moment where creatives also realized, okay, this doesn't really work on a drone. So why use a helicopter over a drone? Well, one of the big things that I think is like you have a certain amount of inertia in a helicopter shot. So on a drone, you're flying a 22, 25 kilo aircraft. It's susceptible to moving around, and the way it does move through the air is maybe like a handheld gimbal, right? That's sort of a comparison to that. Whereas a helicopter feels like you basically laid some track and a dolly into the sky, and it's just got a different weight to the shot. So it feels a lot more planted. It feels a lot more considered. We can fly much bigger lenses, we can fly much bigger cameras, we can fly for, 2.5 hours at a time. Um, and we can obviously go much faster and we can go high to low really quick. So there's a lot of things, a lot of reasons why you should use a helicopter, but there are also a lot of reasons why you should use a drone. So they're sort of, it's quite nice. They sit like next to each other, quite comfortably in terms of like capabilities, whereas a drone could maybe do some really nice establishes and then act as a lock off or do a bit of a crane shot, and you can fly them in fairly good proximity to certain sets and to certain things without causing a big amount of downdraft, whereas the helicopter is obviously quite a presence in terms of noise and wind. They're sort of complementary tools, I would say, and it's I think the industry has sort of settled on a way of saying, okay, this is definitely a helicopter thing or this is a drone thing. However, we do often get shots where it's like, yeah, we tried this on a drone, didn't work. Let's do it on a heli. And I'm sure it happens vice versa as well.
That was a very considered answer. I thought you were just going to stick a middle finger up to DJI and helicopters are
I'll
the
do
best.
that when you stop recording.
Yeah. Final question. I mean, after
Yeah.
all the amazing work that you've done, Mission Impossible, Apex, I know you got like Supergirl and other things coming
Hmm.
out. But where do you think aerial photography could go next? Do you think there's a way that is there like aspects of aerial photography that you don't think that we've seen yet that you think that could be achieved?
I think there are a lot of things, and as technology advances in terms of cameras, lenses, all of that, and the way that filmmaking advances, I think we'll basically, look to move with that. In terms of what we're sort of pushing towards right now, that's sort of like something that was born out of the Mission Impossible films and all of that is we're moving into like high speed fixed wing work, so planes, opening up like 400, 450 mile an hour photography in the air, filming airliners, filming fighter jets. I think one of those big things is, it might be a slightly dying thing, but like doing things for real, doing things practical. I think, AI is obviously the buzzword in the industry, generative things, and it's incredible what you can do with it. However, I wonder whether there is a point in the future where the audience basically looks at everyone and goes, why would I spend 25 quid to go to the cinema if all of this is computer generated? I think there is a level of like, I think people like seeing real things. And I think the craft of it to actually go, how do we plan this? How do we shoot it for real? I think there is also a certain amount of respect that we have to give the audience to be like, look, we're doing this for real. We're showing you a glimpse of the real world, and this is what it is. So I think we're just going to keep pushing into direction where we're going to open doors that basically weren't necessarily open before to do things for real. And yeah, we'll see how that goes for us.
Amazing. Well, thank you again for your
Of course.
time and congrats on Apex and very excited to see more from yourself and the Aerial Film Company.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me.